Professor Descola has devoted his career to peeling back the layers of human civilization and our relationship with the natural world, leading him to an innovative spectrum of thoughts that has reverberated across the academic world and beyond. He studied philosophy and later ethnology under the supervision of Claude Lévi-Strauss. I think this dual dimension is one of the momentum that actually making contributory to both sides, to anthropology and to philosophy. And after several years spent conducting ethnographic research in the Amazon, he was appointed as a lecturer and then as a director of studies at École des Études en Sciences Sociales. He holds the chair of the anthropology of nature at the Collège de France and is director of the social anthropology laboratory. His extensive field work, particularly his immersive ethnographic research in the Amazon, stands as a testimony to his commitment to understanding diverse cultures. This deep engagement has informed his groundbreaking theory, proposing 4 distinct ontologies that redefine how we perceive human interactions with nature. And we have a Chinese flyer for you. I hope that will help you have a good access to these 4 ontologies. These concepts not only challenge the foundational tenets of Western naturalism, but also invite us to envision a world where humanity is not at the center, broadening our perspective on how humans survive in diverse ecologies. Professor Descola's work is a clarion call to appreciate the tapestries of human belief and their intricate attachment to the world around us. His insights beckons us to transcend our established paradigms, urging a more holistic appreciation of the civilizational diversity that enriches the global societies. In his lecture, Professor Descola will share insights from his 20 years tenure as a professor of anthropology at the Collège de France, work that is currently only available in French, entitled Les Formes du Visible. In this volume, he underscored the remarkable impact of images, their power to awaken memories, help organize our thoughts, and express emotions. Significantly, these images also provide views of life from various cultures around the world. So one thing we have to show great appreciation to Professor Descola is that today, right after the talk, he's going to take a long flight back to France. So we are actually asking a lot to have him in the last day of his visit. He has already given several talks already. Okay. So as we settle in to absorb the wisdom he is poised to share with us today, we're not just audience members. We are active participants in a continuing global dialogue that shapes our future. Prepare to embark on a thought-provoking journey that crosses continental divides, spans various cultures, and reshapes our bond with the planet we call home. Please join me in warmly welcoming Professor Philippe Descola.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me clearly? Good. I will indeed talk about images. Everyone knows that images do not speak for themselves. And since the invention of art history not so long ago in Germany, it has been the role of experts to enlighten the public on the type of images that falls within their competence and to ensure that a passionate amateur can grasp something of the intentions of a Melanesian sculptor, a Spanish painter of the Siglo de Oro, or a mask bearer from central Brazil. But the enthusiast will learn all this by bits and pieces, by reading catalogues and scholarly works, all of which shed light on a particular aesthetic. But he can find his way through the forest of images that populate our museums and daily life only by clinging to conventional, purely descriptive categories. These categories are essentially historical and geographical. They are museums of fine art, housing collections of European art classified by periods. They are museums of Asian art, housing objects that Westerners have become accustomed to considering with the same criteria as Western art objects. There are ethnographic museums where we store all objects that do not come from Asia or from the West in the broadest sense, and where we exhibit some objects that have acquired the status of work of art. There are the museums of science and technology, where we find machines and 2- and 3-dimensional representations that have had no artistic vocation initially, not to mention the immense mass of images of all kinds that assail us on city walls, in the press, and on the various screens we visit every day. But these subdivisions of pure convenience do little to illuminate the relationships and contrasts between images. So beyond the singular context of their production and reception, beyond the affinities of style, expression, and technique specific to historical periods and cultural areas, beyond certain common functions that they are deemed to fulfill, do common figurative patterns exist in this immense teeming of iconic forms, media, and representations that could not be explained exclusively in terms of local cultural traditions. In a recent book that was just mentioned, entitled The Forms of the Visible, Les Formes du Visible in French, it's being translated into English and will be available next year if everything goes well. I have attempted to provide an answer to this question. The answer is based on the idea that we only represent what we perceive or imagine, and that we only perceive and imagine what we have learned to discern in the flow of sensitive impressions and to recognize in the meanders of our imagination. Now, this shaping of discernment depends on the qualities we are accustomed to attributing or denying to the objects around us, or to those we imagine in our innermost being. In general, these qualities form a system within what are traditionally called ontologies. In Europe and in North America, for example, cows, trucks, and genetically modified soya are not treated as moral subjects. They have no direct representatives in Parliament, although many speak on their behalf. They have no intrinsic rights they cannot be sued. This is because in our modern ontology, humans and non-humans are perceived as having very different qualities. Although the chemistry and physics of human bodies are indistinguishable from those of animal and plant bodies, or even from those of artifacts, the fact that humans speak, devise and apply rules, invent techniques, is enough for us moderns to make them a class of beings apart. Elsewhere in the world, where other ontologies have developed, such a dissociation makes little sense, and on the contrary, people will tend to treat non-humans as humans because of the social or cognitive qualities they endow them with or perceive in them. They will then find it normal, in Amazonia, for example, to ask an animal they have hunted not to take revenge, or an axe they have been reluctantly lent not to cause them muscular pain. If, as an anthropologist, I have ventured into the world of images, it is because I'm convinced that the task of anthropology is not to provide thick descriptions of specific institutions, cultural habits, or social practices. That is the job of ethnography. And it is also a very satisfying one. I've done both endeavors, both ethnography and anthropology, but they are completely different endeavors. The task of anthropology, by contrast with that of ethnography, is to bring to light the distinctive styles of human action and thought, to understand the ways in which they are combined, and to map their distribution. These styles of action must be understood as cognitive and sensory motor patterns of practice, partly innate, partly the result of the concrete processes of interaction between organisms, that is, the practical ways of integrating the self with the other in a given environment. These cognitive schemas regulate habitus, guide deductions, filter perceptions, and are largely the product of the affordances offered by the world to the specifically human mind. A fundamental function of these schemas is to assign identities by grouping or dissociating elements of the experienced world that appear to have similar or dissimilar qualities. My argument is that one of the universal characteristics of the human mind in which these dispositions are rooted is the awareness of a duality between material processes, which I call physicality, and mental states, which I call interiority. This hypothesis stems from studies in cognitive psychology, in particular developmental psychology, and anthropological literature on the conception of the person, not to mention philosophical intuition. Using this universal grid, humans are able to emphasize, or on the contrary, to minimize the continuities and differences between humans and non-humans. Thus, on the axis of physicality, we can either perceive all physical bodies as fundamentally governed by identical natural, so-called natural principles, or be aware of their differences and infer that what distinguishes different types of entities are precisely the bodies they inhabit. Similarly, on the axis of interiority, we can perceive continuity. All beings can manifest some form of subjectivity, or at least show the appearance of intention, or on the contrary, be sensitive to discontinuities. So humans form a class apart because of their distinctive interiority. Consequently, and despite the great diversity of qualities that we can detect in beings and things, or that we can infer from the clues offered by their appearance and behavior, it is plausible to think that the system of qualities themselves are not infinite, if only for reasons of cognitive economy. Ontologies guide our inferences about the nature of things, so the number of worlds in which we can live simultaneously cannot be unlimited. There are probably no more than 4 ontologies or modes of worlding, each organized according to the continuities or discontinuities, both physical and moral, that humans identify between themselves and the rest of what exists. I put forth this hypothesis some 20 years ago in a book which was later translated into English in 2013, Beyond Nature and Culture, and it deserves some clarification as it will form the backbone of my explanation of images. This table summarizes the argument, if I manage to switch it on. Yes. Let's start with animism. Given the clues it provides, I can assume that any observable entity in my environment possesses an interiority like my own. Whether it is an animal, an artifact, a plant, or a simple presence perceptible by its effects, it seems, like me, animated by intentions of its own, capable of autonomous actions and judgments. On the other hand, the physical appearance under which this entity presents itself or offers itself to my perception differs greatly from my own. Covered in feathers, in scales, with leaves, endowed with wings, with fins, with roots, unable to survive out of water or move about in broad daylight, this entity is predetermined by its body to occupy a specific ecological niche and lead a distinct existence within this ecological niche. The world of a butterfly is not that of a fish, nor that of a man or of a tree. For each of these worlds is both the condition and the result of the actualization of particular organic functions that the other species do not possess. In short, I can think of most of the existing beings around me, whether real or the product of my imagination, as having the following characteristics. Their interiority is not very different from mine, but they differ from me in their physical equipment, in the type of operations this equipment enables them to perform, and in the contrasting points of view it offers them on the world. When such an attitude becomes generalized and systematized within a group of humans, we can speak of animism, an ontology which is common to the natives of Amazonia and northern North America, the subarctic zone, and northern Siberia, as well as peoples of Southeast Asia and Melanesia. Animals, plants, spirits, and certain artifacts are considered and treated as people, as persons, as intentional agents who are said to have a soul, that is, a faculty of discernment, communication, and moral judgment that makes them subjects in their own right, and with whom humans can maintain relationships of all kinds. Because of their position as agents, most existents are reputed to organize their communities in ways like those of humans. They have houses, they have chiefs, they have shamans, they marry according to local rules, they engage in rituals. As the Russian ethnographer Valdemar Bogoras noted long ago in his study of the Chukchi of eastern Siberia, I quote him, "Even the shadows on the wall are tribes in their own right and have their own country where they live in huts and subsist on hunting." And if, despite the difference in physical forms, communication between humans and non-humans is possible, most often in dreams, it is because their bodies are perceived as mere garments covering similar interiorities, that is, capable of exchanging meaningful messages with other entities endowed with the same faculties. In fact, in many parts of the animist archipelago, the word for body is the same as the word for garment. To represent such an ontology, it is necessary simultaneously to render visible the interiority of the different kind of beings, not in the sense of depicting the psychological subtleties of their egos, but in the sense of indicating that they have a subjectivity, whether the bodies of prey, the bodies of predators, the bodies of sky dwellers, the bodies of water dwellers. And these bodies must be identified by species clues in a non-equivocal way. This double requirement already stipulates the minimal figurative conditions of animism. For example, it demands a certain degree of iconicity so that physical envelopes are recognizable by their general form, by a typical attribute or attitude, or even by a movement. It also requires that each figure be represented in its own right, in its singularity as a subject, sometimes in a complementary relationship with another subject, but never never in an overall composition in which its own action would be diluted by that of other agents. This last point is intrinsic to animism. Each type of intentional being has a legitimate point of view on the world, so animist figuration can never claim a privileged position from which to represent an assemblage bringing together a large number of different beings. This is a typical example of an animist image. It's a mask, it's a Fosk mask from the U-Pit of Alaska. As you see, it has a small face embedded in the forefront. So on the one hand, the fact that it is a fox is clearly visible, and so this is the physical form, the physical attribute, the dimension of physicality, and on the forehead is a human figure which figures the human-like interiority of the fox spirit. It's not a human in disguise. It's the fact that the human face is taken here as the symbol, if you wish, of the most visible manifestation of interiority. I won't enter into the different animist images. This is just an example, but I can return to the variety of animist images afterwards when you ask questions, which I hope you will. The idea that I just put forth, that animist figuration can never claim a privileged position from which to represent an assemblage bringing together a large number of different beings, it's exactly the contrary that happens with the ontology with which we are more familiar in the West, which I call naturalism, as it has become established over the last few centuries. Established in texts rather lately in the 17th century, but rendered visible in images much earlier in the 15th century onwards. Moderns define themselves as those who assert that only humans possess interiority, a mind, intentionality, reasoning, a reasoning capacity, etc. But they also assert that humans are otherwise connected to the great continuum of non-humans by their physical characteristics, like clouds, like lampposts, like butterflies. Their material existence is governed by laws from which none of them can escape. This manner of inferring qualities from the objects of our perception can be called naturalism because it has the effect of clearly dissociating in the architecture of the world, and for the first time in human history, the natural, the domain of predictable physical regularities governed by universal principles, from the social and the cultural human conventions in all their instituted diversity. The result is a dissociation between the sphere of humans, the only ones capable of rational discernment, symbolic activity, and social life, and the immense crowd of non-humans doomed to a mechanical, non-reflexive existence, a dissociation that no other civilization had been able to imagine and to systematize. While this ontology has enabled the unprecedented development of science and technology, it has also had the effect not only of disenchanting the world, but also, and perhaps above all, of making it difficult to understand human collectives that were not founded on the same principles. And this is one of the predicaments of anthropology, of course. For the central notions through which Western social sciences conceptualize the modern cosmology, nature, culture, society, history, progress, art, economics, etc., are in fact as recent as the realities they designate, forged for the most part during the 18th century to account for the profound transformations undergone at the time by European societies. These notions, therefore, lack the relevance to account for civilizations which, having not experienced the same historical trajectory, do not set the boundaries between humans and non-humans, where we, in the West, have established them. In this case, the contrast between the subjects' intimate lives and the material constraints that surround them defines the guiding principles of what can be represented. For the two features that a naturalist ontology must first and foremost objectify are the distinctive interiority of humans in general, and of each of them in particular, the genius of the species, if you wish, and the spirit of its members, and the physical continuity of beings and things represented homogeneously in a homogeneous space, a theater of nature, where the role of each person, human person, animal, plant, or artifact is written in that unique language that the scientific mind has brought into being. And this is an example by a painter, which is a favorite of mine, Robert Campin. It's a triptych of an Annunciation from which the central panel has been taken out. And you have on the left the donators, and on the right, Saint Joseph, and on the left, the depiction of the interiority of these human persons that resemble people that you could find in the street. The intensity of their gaze, which is connected, of course, to their devotion, is something which brings forward the interiority of humans. 10 or 20 years before, there was nothing like that in European painting. It's a remarkable shift in the ways humans are depicted. And on the right, you have a small world, which is that of the carpenter's shop of Saint Joseph, with an urban landscape in the background and a meticulous description of all the tools that Saint Joseph as a carpenter is using. And so this kind of description of a scene of ordinary life is also entirely new in the painting, in European painting. Nothing like that either was visible in European painting 20 years before. The fact that the naturalist figurative enterprise is the one about which we have the most information, that it is also perhaps the most reflexive, since image makers have at large written on what they were doing. It's a feature which is shared with image makers in the East also. And the fact also that it is perhaps it has had this tradition since Alberti, at least a host of accredited commentators, are not the least of the difficulties we have to face in order to give an account of it, because there's a huge amount of commentary on it, which is not the case in other iconographical traditions. A third formula, ideally illustrated by Australian totemism, contrasts with both animism and naturalism in that it chooses to ignore the obvious discontinuities between humans, plants, and animals, and instead emphasizes the sharing within a named class of a set of moral and physical qualities that apply equally to humans and to non-humans. Transmitted by the seeds of an ancestral prototype, these moral and physical qualities refer not so much to the form of the bodies as to the substances that make them up, the dispositions that inhabit them, the temperament they manifest, thus making the idea of a relationship of identity between very different looking types of organisms more likely. The qualities shared by the members of a class differentiate them all from the members of other classes belonging to the same system, which contains these other classes, other humans, and other non-humans. Each class is thus ontologically autonomous in that it embodies a particular essence located in a specific site, although it is functionally dependent on other classes, at least for humans, for access to spouses, hunting grounds, and ritual services. Finally, each class identifies itself primarily by the name of its totem, a being that once lived on Earth in what the anthropological literature calls, about Australia, called the dream time, and from which the human and non-humans and non-human members of the group it embodies are physically derived. Totemism is thus much more than a classificatory device using contrasts between natural species to signify contrast between social groups, as Claude Lévi-Strauss argued in Le Totemisme aujourd'hui. It is an ontology in which the qualities perceived in beings and places are detected and distributed in an original way. How can such an abstraction be made visible? Totemic classes that bring together human and non-human beings with very different appearances, but all linked by a common origin and shared dispositions. How can you render this visible? But you can do it by showing the profound identity of their members, of the members of these classes, as derived from the properties of the totem from which they originate. And this identity is both internal, because the members of the totemic class incorporate the same essence, whose name synthesizes the field of predicates they possess in common, but it is also physical, because these members are made up of the same substances, are organized according to the same structure, physical structure, and consequently possess the same type of temperament. Structural homologies and shared references to a common prototype are the characteristics that totemic figuration strives to bring out in images. And this is a very classical example from northwestern Amazonia, people call the Kunwishku. It's a painting on bark, following a method called the X-ray, well, that the anthropologists studying the Kunwishku have called the X-ray method. So as you can see, the kangaroo is painted with his inner parts visible, its skeleton and its organs. And in fact, you see that there is no, by contrast with the preceding image, the naturalist image, there is no setting, there is no environment. The figure is alone and static. There is no interaction with any other being. It's a physical structure that represents the structure of the totemic class. It renders visible an internal organization which defies time. Let's go now to the last formula, which reverses the previous one. Instead of humans and non-humans merging into a class because they share a common essence and substances, it is instead all the components of the world, all the states and qualities it contains, all the parts of which the beings are made, that are distinguished from one another and differentiated into so many singular elements. Like the One Wu, the 10,000 essences or states of ancient China, or the myriad entities making up the great chain of being in medieval cosmology, this ontology is based on the fractioning and individuation of the properties of beings and things. And for a world that is composed of so many singular elements, to be conceivable for the humans who occupy it, for it even to be inhabitable in a practical way without feeling too caught up in chance, it is necessary to link the multiple parts that make it up in a network of systematic correspondences. This is the case, for example, with the correlations between microcosm and macrocosm established by certain divinatory systems, with the medical theory of signatures, with Chinese and African geomancy, or with the idea common, for instance, in Africa, that social disorders, incest, perjury, neglect of rituals lead to climatic catastrophes. This is why I call analogism this ontology of atomization and recomposition that dominated Europe from antiquity to the Renaissance, and whose many contemporary illustrations can still be found in Far Eastern civilizations in West Africa and in the indigenous communities of the Andes and Mexico. Faced with the evidence that the world is populated by an infinite number of singularities, people feel obliged to organize them into chains of meaning and tables of attributes in an attempt to give meaning and order to individual and collective destinies. Compared to other visual ontologies, analogous figuration has some unusual features. Analogism is based on the awareness of a general discontinuity of interiorities and physicalities, leading to a world populated by atoms, a profuse and fragmented world in which humans strive to reduce the proliferation of differences by detecting networks of correspondence between beings, as well as between the parts that make up these beings, in order to make sense of their behavior. However, in such an ontology, where the whole of what exists is fragmented into a plurality of instances and determinations, there are necessarily numerous ways of representing the association of these singularities, so that the objectification of analogism in images will take on more diverse expressions than in other modes of identification. For example, and insofar as analogism emphasizes the disintegration of interiorities and their dispersion in a multiplicity of physical supports, we can expect an effort to desubjectify the interiority of humans and non-humans so that it is disseminated and coupled with an equally distributed physicality. To do this, it is necessary to render visible a set of weak, coherent discontinuities, either directly in a single object or of an ostensibly composite nature, such as a chimera, or indirectly through metonymic embedding effects of the image and what it represents. In other words, the figurative purpose of analogism is above all to render present networks of correspondence between discontinuous elements, a purpose that implies multiplying the image's components to better de-individualize its subject. This is a good example of an analogist image, and it can be taken, the whole set can be taken as a single image. It's a sort of curing altar set up by healers in the Andes. These are not indigenous people, they are mestizos, and the purpose of this device is to cure people who come to seek the help of the healer, and what the healer does is to establish a connection between certain elements of this device and what he sees as the cause and the biographical etiology of the disease of the person who seeks assistance. As you can see, it's composed of many different things. It's both, there are Christian statues of the Virgin, crosses, there are weapons, there are sticks that are used by the traditional authorities in the Andes. There are small bottles with all sorts of preparations and liquids, etc. And each patient is connected to this device by the healer through a different itinerary. So this device is a sort of mechanism through which multiple biographies can be displayed by the multiple paths that the healer will detect among all these objects. So these four systems of qualities detected in the world's objects and made visible in images can sometimes be embodied here and there in highly coherent ontologies expressing the main characteristics of each formula in public statements of various kinds, philosophical treatises, medical treatises, etiological narratives, myths, ritual discourse, etc. From this point of view, we can say, for example, that animism is well represented by Inuit ontology, totemism by the ontology of Australian Aborigines, naturalism by Kantian philosophy, or analogism by the ontology of native Andean cultures. Very often, however, these systems of qualities exist only as a tendency or partially overlap. So rather than seeing them as closed, compartmentalized worldviews, we need to understand them as the phenomenal consequences of four distinct types of inference about the identity of the objects that surround us or that we imagine. Every human is capable of mobilizing one or other of these types of inference depending on the circumstances. But the recurrent identity judgments he will tend to make, such and such an object belongs to such and such a category and can be placed alongside such and such another object. This identity judgment will most of the time follow the type of inference favored by the community in which he has been raised and socialized. So the general idea I wanted to highlight is that identity judgments are not only expressed in statements, but they are also visible in images. In other words, what I want to highlight and what I wanted to put forth in that book I was referring to, and what I want to highlight tonight, is that figuring amounts to making visible the ontological framework of shared worlds. Indeed, if by figuration we mean the universal operation by the means of which material objects, including human bodies, are transformed into agents of social life by being given the function of evoking with greater or lesser resemblance a real or imaginary prototype, then this immemorial way of making present invisible things cannot escape the constraints imposed by the four modes of inference which I evoked above. Each of these ways of worlding will have to guide what is representable and what is not, since each way of worlding determines in its own way what, in the continuous fabric of things and in the flow of possible images, can be discerned or not, fantasized or not. Thus, an animal will obviously not be represented in the same way if it is conceived as a subject, as animism implies, or perceived as an emblem representing a set of qualities, as totemism assumes, or considered as an object without interiority, as naturalism demands, or finally made up of heterogeneous bodily parts, each linked to an aspect of the cosmos, as analogism proposes. What I have attempted to do in the book I was referring to, The Forms of the Visible, then, is to highlight for each mode of identification a corresponding mode of figuration, which may be definable by three criteria. First, the way in which the system of qualities expressed in images by a certain type of worlding is made tangible for a viewer. Second, the type of agency that these images seem to display and the particular circumstances in which this type of agency is activated. And third, the visual means employed to make these type of agency produce an effect. So figuration, understood in this way, does not refer to formal recipes or to iconological archetypes. It makes manifest the links between the structure of an ontology and the means employed to enable an image to represent the structure, this structure, and make it active. In short, I am interested in a morphology of relations, not just in a typology of forms. So the three major questions posed by figuration, to which I have attempted to provide an initial answer, are quite clear. Firstly, what is it that figuration seeks to objectify? In other words, what features of this or that ontology will be made salient in the most common figurative objects? Secondly, what kind of agency are these images invested with? Finally, what visual options have been adopted to make visible this or that property attributed to interiority and physicality, or this or that disposition that these properties induce in this or that class of being? The means used to answer these questions, and of which anthropology has long made fruitful use, is simply comparatism. It is by contrasting objects and phenomena that their characteristics are best brought out. A still life or a seascape appear to be obvious figurations of what they represent until we realize that hardly anyone outside the West has represented such things, and that the conventions for representing the physical environment, human individuality, or non-human or non-humans that seem so natural to Westerners are elsewhere absent or quite distinct. So far from wishing to highlight false similarities, shaky homologies, or deceptive continuities, I seek to highlight contrasts between images captured in the same space of transformation, namely the opposition between interiority and physicality, for it is from systematically organized difference that the intelligibility of forms and processes can emerge. I've outlined the three questions I'm trying to answer. As you have gathered, the first is ontological. What are the characteristics of the world that images give us to see? The second is formal. What visual means do image makers use to achieve this? And the last is pragmatic. What are the devices and circumstances of image ostentation that transform them into iconic agents? The hypothesis I have developed is that these three questions, which have been treated separately by historians of art and by philosophers of arts, are linked. More precisely, what I surmise is that the ontological regimes that govern the figuration of images condition their formal organization and the different ways in which they are animated. I've already said a word about the four ontological regimes of images. I would now like to clarify what I mean when I propose that these ontological regimes are also differentiated by their representational geometry and by the mechanisms of their animation. Transposing three-dimensional objects onto a flat surface requires that choices be made from a range of often interdependent optical solutions that involve much more than perspective options. The first criterion concerns the point of view, that is, the alternative of constructing the image from a single observation point position, as in linear perspective, or from multiple points of view, as is the case, for example, with the so-called split representation of the northwest coast of North America, a technique to which Franz Boas already drew attention almost a century ago in his book, Primitive Art. Let us recall the principle, which is to produce a two-dimensional image that shows aspects of a being, whether a human, an animal, a spirit, usually hidden when represented in frontal view, such as the back and parts of the flanks. To achieve this, the two sides of the body and sometimes the back of the body are spread out on either side of an imaginary median line drawn from the top of the face to the bottom of the pelvis. One of the best known illustrations of this process, provided by Boas, is the painting of a bear which he took from the front of a Tsimshan house on the northwest coast. And you can see that the flanks seen from the front are joined on either side by an invisible central fold here that originates at the bottom, here at the bottom of a slit and goes until the end of the body. And in fact, the slit there is the index that shows that it is a split representation, that it is the deployment of the two flanks on either sides of the medium line here, the sagittal axis of symmetry, because of course the bear has a rounded head and not a split in the front. Strange as it may seem to an eye, and I must add that I've seen things like that. I visited the National Palace Museum the other day on the bronzes, of course, on the ancient bronzes. Yeah, you have exactly the same kind of split representation. So it's a very wide, widely used form of what I call polyperspectivism, that is the attempt to depict a being or a scene from different points of view. And this, in particular, so-called split representation, on which Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote an article years ago, is quite common in very different parts of the world, as can be judged from the similarity of the devices used on the northwest coast and in ancient China. So strange as it may seem to an eye trained in linear perspective, this type of arrangement actually enables a greater number of the model's physical features to be represented, including those that the human eye cannot see simultaneously. It thus opposes the illusionist vision of European painting, which reproduces and emulates that of the human gaze by omitting to represent what cannot be perceived. For example, the other side of a face seen in profile. In the Northwest Coast iconography, what Western tradition calls realism is a conceptual realism. That is, it is a realism that is faithful to a true rendering of the properties of beings and not imitative of appearances. So the construction, this kind of construction of polyperspectival visual spaces was not unknown in Europe before naturalism. It was common in the Middle Ages. As you can see here, which is an illustration for a book of hunting, the man who is swimming in the pond is seen from above, while the flowers are represented as being seen from a front perspective, and the falcon attacking the foal is represented. They are both represented as seen from the front also. So this is a classic example of polyperspectivism, of medieval polyperspectivism. As we can see from these examples, the variable of the point of view is fundamental, as it immediately reveals the formal differences between figurative options. From the 15th century until the Cubist Revolution, which brilliantly rehabilitated the multiplicity of viewpoints, most European images were constructed from a single vantage point. An unusual choice in the history of figuration, and one that becomes exceptional when, as in Europe, it is combined with another peculiarity, namely the adoption of a moderate distance from the center of the projection. This preference is illustrated by Leonardo da Vinci's precept that the painter should place himself at a distance at least 10 times greater than the size of the object to be depicted. And linear perspective, as defined by Alberti's principles of construction, corresponds to the formal characteristics arising from a single point of view situated at a moderate distance to which a projective transformation is applied, implying a convergence of the projection lines between the subject of the composition and the point of observation, as well as an obliquity between the image plane and the subject plane. And there's a very good illustration of that in the famous spectrograph by Albrecht Dürer. In his famous essay of 1927, Perspective as Symbolic Form, Erwin Panofsky showed that this unusual choice that I've just mentioned had the effect of making visible a new relationship between subject and world, between the human point of view and a mathematically constructed space in which the shape, arrangement, and size given to objects are a function of their distance and orientation from the observer. This new form of worlding thus presents the paradox that the infinite homogeneous space it creates is nonetheless constructed and oriented from an arbitrary position, that of the position of the observer, of course. It creates a distance between the human subject and the world, while entrusting the subject, the observing subject, with the condition of autonomizing the world. According to Panofsky, who uses this very accurate formula, it's an objectification of the subjective. And linear perspective as an objectification of the subjective thus institutes a face-to-face relationship between the individual and nature that is the hallmark of modern ontology, and which Western landscape painting best embodies in the field of art. To a single point of observation, focusing a projective transformation at medium distance, almost all other iconographic traditions have preferred multiple points of observation and an orthogonal transformation seen as at optical infinity, which is the surest means of decoupling the objects we wish to make visible from a too obvious human intentionality. In all other figurative systems, in fact, but with notable variations, it is understood that the objects depicted represent being places, or phenomena in which man has no real part. Whether they be totemic prototypes, divinities, cosmogenesis, spirits, enchanted places, their point of view, their power of reproduction, or their particular atmosphere must be evoked by minimizing as far as possible man's part in their figuration. Such is the case, for example, with this contemporary representation of a cosmogenesis by a Huichol painter from northern Mexico. It's a very complex painting, and I cannot begin to describe everything that takes place there, but I think you will see by yourself that the painting juxtaposes a series of different points of view, and also echoes in a complex way what the viewer and what is viewed. Not only is each figure represented from a different vantage point than its neighbors, but the image as a whole is a sort of kaleidoscopic interplay of juxtapositions, echoes, and encompassments from a multitude of viewpoints, including that of the viewer. Humans are not present in there, and the vantage point, the naturalist vantage point, which is an emulation of the human gaze, is completely absent there. Beyond the light that each figurative regime sheds on the furnishings of a world and the relationships between the objects that make it up, beyond what it reveals about the formal processes that construct pictorial space and guide the way viewers see what is offered to their gaze, each regime is also characterized by the type of animation that those for whom the images are intended lend to them, and characterized also by the nature of the places and occasions in which these images come to life, and by the relational devices within this animation, within which this animation becomes operative. For images and the peculiarities of their behavior as ordinary agents of social life do not escape the carousel of transformations that distributes beings and their predicates across the surface of the earth. And it is by this yardstick that we must consider the modalities of their animation. An image, whether addressing an enigmatic smile to a group of tourists visiting the Louvre, or presenting a face bathed in tears to a pure soul kneeling in the side chapel of a Tuscan church, whether facing a terrified child in the square of an Amazonian village, or greeting a sister during a palanquin ride in the Himalayas, an image does not address in the same way those who look at it and allow themselves to be looked at by it. To assert that the impressions produced on the person interacting with an image would be caused each time by the same projective mechanisms assumes that these effects are identical in each of the occurrences, which is obviously not the case. If you accept the type of ontological pluralism I am defending here, the variability of the types of action attributed to images is not surprising. Depending on the mode of identification that prevails in the singular world experienced by each collective, the beings of which this world is composed, and the qualities attributed to them will be very different from those detected by other collectives in the wave of phenomena offered to their observation. And so the degree of autonomy of these beings, the behavior expected of them, their capacity to intervene in human affairs, the situations in which they can manifest their properties will also fluctuate according to the ontological filters employed here and there in the process of worlding. Of course, it would be foolhardy to claim that each ontological regime under which images are represented coincides with a single type of agency. The functions that images are made to assume, the circumstances of their ostension, and the social networks in which they are inserted are too diverse for such correspondences to be systematic. Nevertheless, it is possible to identify dominant forms of transforming iconic artifacts into agents, either by attributing intentions to them, as is the case with animism, or by manipulating their traces, as is the case with totemism, or by interpreting their behavior in the manner of analogism, or by deluding oneself about their reality, as is the case with naturalist viewers. I don't have the time to enter into the details of these forms of animating images, but I may provide a few examples if you ask me questions afterwards. Finally, I would like to conclude by pointing out the limits of a project that may seem overambitious. The infinite variety of images, their increasing hybridization, and the fact that we are in many cases unaware of what motivated their genesis and how they were received make it illusory to automatically apply discriminating criteria that would function as universals. At the very most, we can attempt to discern the figurative tendencies specific to each of the four major modes of identification that I have distinguished, not by examining the entire iconography of the cultural areas or historical periods that correspond to them, which is obviously impossible, at least for a single person, but by relying in this task on a double guarantee of verification. On the one hand, to prove that these tendencies are detectable wherever I had previously isolated, on the basis of purely discursive clues, the presence of one of these modes of identification, and on the other hand, to ensure that where several tendencies seem to coexist within the same collective, it is possible to establish that it is the result of historical or structural combinations whose logic can be uncovered. To give an idea of how these combinations are organized, I have devoted a chapter of my book, The Forms of the Visible, to a particular case of hybridization, in this case between totemism and animism. It comes from the Tsimshian people of Canada's Pacific coast, the same who painted the house front that we've seen, where animist images used in ritual coexist with totemic images used to denote social positions. These images often represent the same thing, but with different conventions. Take the case of the eagle, which is both one of the 8 Tsimshian totemic animals and therefore a provider of motifs and names for coats of arms, for crests, and a spirit commonly embodied in certain ceremonies by an actor wearing a mask, such as the one that belonged to the chief Somerdic. The wearer of the mask, that is on the left, would move around the audience, imitating the eagle's aggressive behavior, striking out with his talons as he passed, each scratched person then receiving a gift for their trouble. But Chief Somerdic was also a prominent member of the Eagle clan, and as such was entitled to display a crest in the form, for example, of a ceremonial headdress of the kind he wears in this illustration on the right. The photo is not very clear. It's a stuffed eagle head, in fact, which is used as a headdress. This heraldic headgear on the right was in use among chiefs and figures of high lineage. Consequently, as the juxtaposition of the two photos makes abundantly clear, when a Tsimshian of a high lineage wears an eagle mask in an animist ceremony, he is personifying a spirit that is contemporary with him. When he wears a ceremonial headdress figuring the image of an eagle in a potlatch, he is displaying a coat of arms, a crest, testifying to an inherited totemic quality. And so the Tsimshian are interesting in the sense that they show elements both of totemism and animism, and it becomes visible in the images they produce. Let me add that, in fact, animist images and totemic images were produced by different classes of image makers who bore different names, had different kind of prestige, and in fact, very awkwardly for us, who have given such an importance in our museums to totemic masks. The sculptors of totemic masks were less considered as the makers of headdresses that represented totemic quality. So it's a single case, not the only one I've endeavored in the forms of the visible to try to discern in contemporary paintings the kind of hybridity which is displayed here among the Tsimshian, but based on different criteria. But so even a single case or two is not much if we admit that the hybridization of ontologies and therefore of images is nothing exceptional. But it is enough, I think, if we follow Marcel Mauss when he remarks that, I quote him, "It is an error to believe that the credibility of a scientific proposition depends on the number of cases in which we believe we can verify it. In this respect, the reality of a relationship, he follows on, established in a single case but methodically and meticulously studied, is more certain than the proof provided by a jumble of facts borrowed confusedly from the most diverse cultures. This is the research strategy that Marcel Mauss has followed, and which has gained him a wide recognition of one of the great figures of European anthropology, and his results, I think, are sufficiently solid to encourage me to follow his advice. With this, I conclude this talk. I'm, of course, completely open to questions for probably things that you may not have fully understood or examples that you would like me to develop. Thank you for your attention.
Yeah, thank you very much, Professor Descola. Godard, the filmmaker, Swiss filmmaker, he said somewhere, I forgot where and when, but he said something like the perspective is the Western, is the ontological, original scene of the Western world. So I remembered this when you were explaining this terrible painting by Durer, the Perspectograph. And I was puzzled by what you saw at the Imperial College Museum. You made this comparison between this fascinating Xinjiang bear and bronze that you saw at the museum. And sorry, it's not an articulated question. It just came to my mind and just so that my colleagues ask other questions. Thank you.
I think I wouldn't speak in terms of original sin, but what I perceive in what one could call monoperspectivism is a very clear definition of what the naturalist mode of identification or ontology is about. That is a face-to-face confrontation between the subject and the world, which has been ignored elsewhere in favor of polyperspectivism, but polyperspectivism that takes many different forms. I think you can see it by contrasting the image of the bear with the image of the witch-owl painter. They are both polyperspectivists, but with different conventions. It's something that is difficult to admit now as monoperspectivism with the expansion of European images has become a sort of quasi-normal filter for the perception of images. And I noticed here in Taiwan that by contrast with the usual perspective, the Chinese painting perspective, which is multi-layered with the void and the clouds that separates the separate layers. There is more and more European type perspective landscapes, that follow this process of objectification of the world. So we are used to that, because also moving images in the cinema in particular tends to propagate this monoperspectivism, except among gifted filmmakers that manage to multiply the points of view. I'm thinking here of someone called Lucien Castin-Taylor, who is the head of the film department in Harvard, and who has shot a film which I don't know if it was presented here in Taiwan, but it made a great stir. It's called Leviathan, and it's a film about a fishing boat, where in fact the fishermen are seen from the point of view of the fish. And so it's a very clever way of filming. He invented devices in order to put the camera in certain places that would give the impression of it's not filmed at the level of human height, no, but at different positions, etc. So they are filmmakers that have escaped this, and of course, the Cubism is the first example of a return to polyperspectivism. Les Demoiselles d'Avignon is a polyperspectivist figure painting, and Cubism as and contemporary painting has multiplied this polyperspectivism. So we are now in a situation where there's as I was mentioning, with the contamination of landscape painting here in Taiwan by monoperspectivism, where there are a cohabitation between different kinds of traditions and images. Some of them are polyperspectivist, others are monoperspectivist, and some of them who are polyperspectivist are difficult to grasp. No, the Cubism is all right in a sense, and because it is akin to the beer painting or to the beer image, but some forms of polyperspectivism, like the Huichol, this is why I showed it. The Huichol painting are very difficult to apprehend for us who are used, for us Westerners, even after the emergence of a new polyperspectivism, to see that as something which is as easily easy to be interpreted, no? Well, no, I'll stop at that.
Hi, I'm a Chinese art historian, so I'm probably not in the same line as your thoughts. So it's very interesting, the whole talk, and I'm not so sure I get any point. So I really hope the English translation will come out very soon. And I'm just curious about, for example, it seems that you did not talk a lot about the agency of receiver or the mechanism of seeing or looking. For example, it seems very clear, this kind of difference between totemism or naturalism. Or for example, like maybe let us just focus on naturalism. For example, what is naturalism? You talk about perspective, and then what's and also talk about this kind of physical continuity and their relationship about perspective, the using perspective. So I'm just curious, is that perspective universally being recognized by the receiver in all parts of the different kind of culture as something naturalism? For example, for the Chinese eye, probably those kind of, three-step perspective probably is not a single pointed, but for the Chinese eye, maybe, I don't know because I'm not a Chinese in the 15th century. But for the Chinese in the 15th century, for them probably and those kind of perspectives are the material continuity are deemed as some kind of naturalism. Because this kind of classification seems that from our modern eyes, but from each For example, like this one, would this be naturalism from their perspective? I don't know. I mean, so can you talk a little bit about, because I'm always very curious about perspective. I mean, why perspective could be, what kind of mechanism could that people in China in the 18th century, when they look at it, they almost equally say, oh, how real. But actually are coming from different background, for example, from the Renaissance people. So it seems that when we see seeing is kind of culturally constructed, but on the other hand, it seems there's a universal thing that very physical. And so I guess I have several layers of questions here.
Yes, I think I distinguish at least two layers. One is on agency, and the other is on perspective, and they should be dissociated. So I'll deal first with the question of agency. There's been an important reappraisal of this question in the history of art in the past 30 years, let's say, with mainly in Germany, with people like Horst Bredekamp, Hans Belting, Michael Friedberg in the United States, in anthropology with Alfred Gell, and as an aftermath of some idea that was already present much earlier on in R.B. Warburg's books, for instance. What I propose about agency, as I said, is that instead of the position adopted by people like Friedberg or by Gell or by Bredekamp, there are different kinds of producing animation according to the ontological regime of iconology. I'll take one example. The ontological regime of totemism produces agency in an indexical way and not in an iconic way. Let me explain that. When, by contrast with animism, animism is a question of rendering spirits visible and active by having humans either wear masks, sing songs, or move about and personify and embody the point of view of spirits. So there must be an iconic dimension for the audience to recognize what kind of spirit it is, hence the mask of the force, for example. In totemic rituals, the personification not of spirits but of the ancestral prototypes is rendered visible not by an iconic description of these prototypes, because nobody knows how they looked. There's a connection in which I cannot enter because it's a complex connection with the animal prototype. But these are not animals. The prototypes are not animals, in spite of the fact that most, about 70% of the name of totems in Australia are name of animals. They are not, the prototypes are not animals, they are qualities. And these qualities serve also to designate an animal. So they are not animals proper, if you wish. And so how do you embody these prototypes? You embody them in an indexical way by depicting on the body of the dancers who personify the prototypes, the itinerary that they followed when they were on Earth. So it's a representation of a map, in a way, which serves to identify them, but not iconically as a representation of the kind of beings that were present at the time. So this is an indexical way, which also can be found in certain images of which I have not the time to talk here, in Australia, especially in Central Australia, where images are not of the totems, but of the traces they left on the land, and which results in this painting, which have become quite famous now in the modern art market. Each of these mode of identification has its own way of producing or rendering visible the agency of images. Now about perspective. The interesting thing, the reason I showed a painting by Robert Campin and not a classical painting by a northern Italian artist following the rules of Alberti is that there are two ways to figure the homogeneity of the world. One is through the gaze mathematically constructed of the observer, displaying a world which is based entirely on his position and the construction that can be made of his gaze in order to precisely construct a scene. Another one is in the northern painters, such as Campin and Van Eyck and all these people, is to render plausible the complexity of the world by depicting the world in a profusion of details, not necessarily organized in terms of perspective. Many of the painting, even Van Eyck, has not the mastery of linear perspective as had his contemporaries in northern Italy. So perspective is only one aspect or one dimension of this obsession of rendering the world visible as a systematic scene observed by someone. The difference with Chinese painting, which is organized around different criteria, in particular the difference between the different stages and the orientation of the houses, which is always so peculiar for a Westerner to see this combination. The difference is that in the case of Chinese landscape, there is an important aspect of the agency of the viewer. The viewer participates to the construction of the painting in the same way that the first landscapes were incense burners or ink pots, in the form of mountains, which allowed the literati to enter, in fact, the world of the immortals by projecting themselves in the incense burner or the ink pot in the form of a mountain. In the same way, the viewer is not so much attentive to perspective as to the possibility for entering in the landscape. And entering in the landscape means that you cannot have the kind of perspective that is constructed, let's say the Florentine perspective, because the Florentine perspective is too obviously a projection of the view, of the gaze of the observer, by contrast with the Chinese landscape. I don't know if I've answered your question right.
Okay, that was a complex question, and then Professor Descola has answered it extensively. I think basically it's a really a talk of different kinds of language. Descola's way of trying to analyze images, and then your more historian way of looking at images. So we have to, yeah, maybe. So we have you, and then you'll be the last one. Okay. Okay, please.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I really enjoyed it. I'll keep my question pretty short. I just wanted to know more about how do you think these different ontologies develop? I know you talked about yes, being taught, conditions, social condition. And it has to do with the different kind of trajectories these different societies take, modernization, the relationship to labor, land. I just wanted to see what you thought about what is like the root cause, the main factors for like how these ontologies develop.
It's a tricky question in the sense that I don't think there is a historicity of ontologies, or even if there is, it's still a question clouded in mystery in many respects. What I find is that there are, if I under torture could admit that probably there are two basic ontologies initially, evolutionary in an evolutionary perspective, which is totemism, which is extremely stable, and animism, which transforms into analogism for a variety of logical criteria, because what the difference between animism and analogism is a multiplication of the components of the subject. So a multiplication of the components of interiority and a multiplication of the components of physicality. So this proliferation of components of the subjects transforms completely, and the animism, which is based on a very simple opposition between the soul, let's say, and the body, even if there are different components of the soul, etc. But basically, it's a dual system. And analogism is the conditions for the emergence, at least the historical condition for the emergence of naturalism, because it emerged in the Renaissance. I'm fond of using sets of images from a book of images that is called the Very Rich Hours of the Duke of Berry, Les Très Riches Heures du Duc de Berry, which is a book of prayer that was painted in the 15th century by the Limbourg brothers. And in this book, you have at the same time images that were in the same way as the painting by Campin, which would be unheard of 20 centuries before. That is a representation, for instance, of people cultivating or sowing a field in front of the Louvre in Paris, as it was at the time. So it's completely illusionist in the sense that you see the steps of the person sowing in the soft ground, etc., etc. And in the same book, there is an image by the same, it's a group of brothers, which represents the zodiacal man, that is the correspondence between, in fact, the human body and the different signs of the zodiac, which is an old way an ancient way to depict the connection between microcosm and microcosm, which dates from the Egyptians. You have representations of that among the in Rome, etc., etc. And so, in the same book, you have the two representations. One which is obviously analogist, and because it represents the relationship between microcosm and macrocosm, which is typically analogist, does not exist among the animist or the totemist. And another one which is completely naturalist. So the 15th century is an interesting period in that sense that it coincides. It's the period where naturalism emerges. There were some aspect of analogism still subside. Analogism that's what I did in the book of which I was mentioning. It's a lot. It's 840 pages. So I tried to condense some of the very tiny parts of the arguments of the book. But you can see in contemporary painting of the 20th century the kind of inferences that contemporary artists have made because they were, in a way, they felt free to let loose the kind of inferences that was blocked or inhibited by traditional training before. And for instance, if you look at Dali's paintings, Dali is a complete analogist painter. But there are also animist painters, modern painters, in the 20th century. So you find the adoption of certain forms independently in different parts of the world, and also in the work of contemporary image makers. What I find interesting, and this is the last comment perhaps, is in the same way that naturalism appeared in images before it appeared in texts in the 17th century. So during 2 centuries, image makers presented an image of the world that was that did not correspond to the features that were admitted before. And in the same way, contemporary painting from the Cubist onwards have begun to present a non-naturalist ways of worlding. And this is why I'm interested in contemporary artists, because some of them are very original in completely subverting the typical features of naturalism.
Thank you for your interesting and progressive photography for the working of pictures. It's quite fresh and exciting for me, especially it makes me think to Jacques Convey's 4 types of critical art and Bruno Latour's early research experience with anthropologists together. My question is about you make some interesting examples from west to east, ancient to classical age in today's talk and the reference fire. And what's the meaning of contemporary for the wording of picture topography in your opinion? Will it become like Latour said, we have never been modern, or honestly, we have to admit radically that pictures have never been classical?
Yes, some years ago, we have been discussing this with Bruno Latour, who was a close friend for many years. And in a workshop in, where was it? I think it was in Liège, in Belgium. We had a long discussion about this question. I think we've become modern, and and even Bruno admitted that at the end of his life. At least he had, what he was prepared to admit is that we had become, we had entered into a new form of analogism. And he used this formula several times. I think the images are a good point for that, in the sense that it's obvious that they, independently of any sociological analysis or epistemological analysis of text or whatever, images show there is something new that appears in the 15th century and that goes on for a while until it's replaced by something different. And so this something new and the disappearance of this something new in the early 20th century, I take it to be the appearance and the disappearance of naturalism. The question is, and this is why, as I mentioned a moment ago, I'm interested in contemporary art, is that we don't know yet where we are going. We know that naturalism is being subjected to movement of destruction and erosion. It's still very active in many respects, but we don't know how this decomposition is going, where this decomposition will lead us. And I think that, again, artists are, there's an artist whom I particularly like by the name of Pierre Huyghe. He's a French artist who lives in New York, and one of his installations called Umwelt is a quite extraordinary combination. There is a beehive, there is and it's difficult to explain. There's a box containing self-replicating cancer cells that activate images. But they do not activate images of cancer cells. They activate a series of images which are not activated at random, but according to certain criteria of the kind of cells that are being produced by this device. There are many other things now, and the whole installation renders completely illusory the possibility of distinguishing between nature and culture, nature and society, etc. Because there are technical devices, biological organisms, images that are artificial images produced by a biological mechanism, etc., etc. All his work is in that kind. No, it's destructive of the dualism we have been used to in the West, and so. But still, we still have to ponder what exactly it is that we are going to. Where exactly are we going to until doomsday comes, and the question will be irrelevant.
Okay, I think Professor Descola, maybe I share with you my little take in of what he has here. It's very rich, and you can see it's really very ambitious research. But as far as I see, I realize, I don't know, I mean, maybe Professor Descola would disagree with me. But if I see that Professor Descola raises the question of visibility, Usually in the humanities, we talk about meaning, right? But now for Professor Descola, it's very important as well to talk about visibility as a very important issue. And I also appreciate Professor Descola here as a way of honest observation about how images world of the contemporary they appear to us is not clear, and then we are in this uncertain future. Perhaps we could read more of Professor Descola's book and try to find out what we can do together with him. And then I have to say, I forgot to mention that this event has been organized by College of Liberal Arts, and I actually am here on behalf of our dean here, Professor Zhen here. And then also, we are also having the EUTW OMON, the chair of OMON, not here. Okay, and then we also have and also this is also being made possible by École Française de Taipei, right? And then we have to thank Monsieur Mokan for this event as well. And then, of course, finally, we have to give a very heartfelt applause for and thank you for Professor Descola. And then also, after you do so, please don't leave. We also want to have an image of you together with this Professor Descola. Please, thank you.